Well, welcome, creatives, community, and kind folks out there. Today is World Building Wednesday, and today's subject is technology versus magic and psionics. Um, for the most part, in general, just basically uh, talking about the subject of adding in or limiting or improving the technology in your world as you're building it, and the problems and solutions and thanks, Vince, for all of the technological problems you may have in your setting and what to do with them. All right, so one of the issues, technology and magic, and I say psionics because in many ways. Magic is replaced by psionics, especially in some near future to far future settings. And so basically, it's technology, it's the use of mechanisms versus the internal power of whatever it is in your setting. Um, and how they can mix or turn or twist and use that when you're world building. Um, I think oftentimes this problem either comes up with fantasy realms and it comes up with far future. All right, and it seems like they're opposite problems as well. Usually in fantasy, it's like sword and sorcery, and the minute you introduce technology into it, higher levels of technology, people start to their brains start to explode and they start to go down a rabbit hole, uh, which if you guys have ever listened to me for any reason, you'll know that um, when talking about these things, you wasting the energy by having the argument above board and above the table at the moment you're playing the game, I think is a waste of the energy. It's not a focus of the energy. When in doubt, role play it out, right? Now, when it comes to modern day into the far future, introducing magic or psionics or whatever the power is, um, less controversy, but sometimes there can be problems because usually it's considered a limiting factor. There's usually only a very few number of individuals that can use these abilities. Star Wars being a perfect example of Jedi and Sith or whoever having the ability to use the Force where other people cannot, and equalizing that power out and those abilities out amongst the players and the rest of the world, especially if you can disarm a smuggler or a bounty hunter, but you can't disarm somebody if their power's in their mind. Vincent says, but at least in sci-fi settings, Sonics is very, very limited. And also that, the idea that you're only as powerful as the individual is another limiting factor. So it's not that someone has, hey, I can control the Force and crack planets in half. It's usually highly limited in terms of what capabilities the individual has based on the gaming system, their level, the die rolls, those kind of things. So, but the real problem. So let's dive into it and let's face facts, right? The real problem in fantasy when introducing technology usually aren't the things that really change society, right? I'm thinking printing presses, um, refined manufacturing, instant communication, mass transit. Those things, many times, most people don't balk at that. The big argument usually comes in firearms, explosives. That's the one that really sets people off and it really triggers them. And then it's just like, oh, I can't believe in this world. Um, Vince says, yeah, magic tends to be more focused on the individual, while technology is usually equipment. Yeah, and Bruce says, psychers in a world 40K setting, powerful but dangerous to yourself and others. And when you want to introduce that, let's say, I don't know, you want to play a modern day setting, like it's today, but there's a lab that had a drug and it allows your minds to, expand or something. As a game master, you can just say, hey, okay, I'm going to introduce this into this modern setting. I'm going to introduce other things as well. Here's the limitation. Hey, if you roll this, you can mind control the guard, but if you fail, you'll get the nosebleeds and whatnot. You'll get the hair loss and the veins in your forehead will start popping out or something like that, right? You can't control it, and all of a sudden your brain is overloaded by all the thoughts of all the people around you for 500 feet. Like those are not just tropes that we've seen many times, but it makes sense in the context of here's this new thing that's being introduced into the world. I wonder sometimes that why isn't that limiting factor also included with technology when attempting to add technology into a fantasy world? Vincent says there are some super powerful force users in Star Wars or Psionics and Star Trek too. But they're very, very rare and usually have reason to be more powerful than usual. It is not the default. Exactly. So if we take that example and overlay that example into technology in the past, into fantasy realms, usually we start to think of, for example, I believe it's Lamentations of the Flame Princess, OSR game, where it's more Victorian with firearms and such. And oftentimes, despite what I think are far more world-changing technologies, like the printing press, like mass transit, like refined manufacturing, usually it's firearms. And the minute firearms are introduced, explosive powder and firearms, the alchemical process used to create it, usually we end up stopping the game, and then we get into these debates about how much firearms had basically eliminated the classic medieval fantasy knight and those with weapons and armor and such. And we fail to realize that despite the fact that there is evidence, it is also only evidence of one particular example. We have literally one example of that happening, and that is our own history. It happened once. Also, we in hindsight, we tend to advance history and technology into this homogenized version of, hey, guns existed, therefore swords stopped being used. And that's not very much the case. Vince says it is not the default in Lamentations, just in our Rose of Westhaven campaign. Okay. That's probably exactly what I did. I'm overlaying whatever. Says, but to be honest, I don't really like firearms in that game. I rarely use them with my character. Yes. Prue says some GMs like to use that danger for guns, like Mercer's guns. You roll for danger. And Vince says they are loud, have misfire chance, rare ammunition, and take long to reload. Yes. Let's see. Prue says guns and such get those rolls all the time in Shadowrun and 40K systems. Exactly. And also, I think there's this idea that the minute firearms are introduced, that they're automatically like AK-47s, and for a very long time they were not. Just like you guys said, like most firearms, even flintlocks were rare. Let's see. I pulled up a firearm timeline, and in the firearm timeline, even in the firearm timeline, like I think it says there's this PBS 1364 first recorded use of a firearm. All right, so then even in that case, we're talking, the mid 1300s, and even before that, explosive powder was used. And so even if you have the first recorded use of a firearm, these things were like, they had like a burning wick. What's the description they have here? Before the matchlock pistol, guns were fired by holding a burning wick to a touch hole in the barrel, igniting the barrel inside. A shooter uses one hand for firing and a prop to steady the gun. The first device or lock for mechanically firing a gun is the matchlock. The powder is held in a flash pan and ignited by a wick or match in a movable clamp. It's like, I think I think sometimes we creatives try to kind of like jump ahead of the creative process, and we automatically are like, oh man, everyone's got like revolvers and they're just shooting through armor and plate mail and things, and you don't necessarily have to have that happen. Now, another argument would be, well, the minute firearms are created, they're going to dominate. And my answer to that would be, well, how do you know that? In your setting, in your world, it's not necessary that firearms are automatically distributed to the people equally all the time. Vincent says the big advantage first firearms used to have is that you need little to no training, exactly, to shoot, because they are good in large numbers, and even a skilled marksman would rarely hit every time. While training an archer takes years, with firearms you simply point and shoot, and that's really the where I think the drama can come in when you try to introduce technology into fantasy, right? It's the fact that even with archery, it takes training. With magic, it takes training. It takes years. Even with archery, they end up creating the crossbow, because even true archers took many years to train, and that training process, it's the the cost effect analysis, right? How much effort are you using? Does it take to train up a force of individuals, even archers, before they're good enough to use them, versus like the firearm and such? And so what ended up happening is numbers really is what you're talking about, rather than a technology. If you can get a huge number of people together to use a piece of technology, that may outweigh the need for their skill. So you could maybe have undertrained archers, but if you've got 1,000 of them all firing at the same time off the castle walls, then that may outweigh the idea of having a more advanced weaponry to give them. Yeah, Vince says crossbows are very similar firearms in that regard, and I would actually probably I could see an argument that before firearms really took over, that the crossbow was kind of like its first. I mean, I know it's not direct, but I would say like the crossbow might be, the air quotes, the first firearm where really the technology of having something that could really penetrate and use it without training may have taken over. Proof says, I went to talk about black powder the other day and learned about the vast differences in quality of it. That could be a fun use in an old world setting. If the powder is bad quality, you get, wimpy shots and explosions. And yeah, and Vince says, yeah, and if it gets wet, it basically becomes useless. And I think those are the kind of things that, the black powder, when the weapons are damaged, how do you fix them? Where does the shot come from? In your gaming world, in your fantasy world, how are the guns loaded, reloaded, cleaned, fired? Like, does the person actually have to pour the powder down inside and put the ball inside in the wadding, and then take the rod out and jam it down inside of the rifle or the pistol before firing? And then do they have to light the wick on top, or is it a matchlock pistol? Those kind of things, I believe, are going to be your limiting factors as a game master when you're designing them and introducing them into the world. Yeah, Bruce says completely useless. Yes, and those guys fired their old rifles. It took the fast of them 20 plus seconds to reload. And frame shift. Hello, frame shifts. If guns filled the spot of crossbows, did anything in our world fill the spot of archery? I'm thinking the firearm. I mean, in terms of when my brain just stopped. When Frameshift says what replaced archery, I'm thinking you're meaning like what is a highly skilled ranged ability or device. Wow. I mean, you could go with the javelin and spear maybe, but I'm thinking the the bow probably took over for those just because of space limitations and skill. I'm not sure if anything replaced that. Vince says, but how do you emulate the difference in training time in actual game? Most games do not make a difference between complexity of a weapon. Guns, but only after they become reliable, and sniper rifles. Yeah, it's and that's the thing, right? Most games default into player characters having a high level of skill in what they do. And then when you tack onto that firearms, you're adding a very high level of skill with a technology that doesn't require them to have a lot of skill to use. And so, of course, there are many other limiting factors. Like, for example, if you have a player character who has firearms, one of the things that I think is, and you're going to get, I'm sure I'm going to get a ton of thumbs downs on this, that we automatically assume that firearms are vastly more powerful than any other weapon out there. But my contention would be that in classic Dungeons and Dragons, the classic longsword does 1d8 damage. It doesn't cause bleeding. It doesn't hack off limbs. It doesn't poke people's eyes out. It doesn't cause internal damage. There are no rules for it. And the only reason the D8 was picked as the damage is because Gary Gygax and Arneson or whoever, they just decided that's going to be the damage. There was no scientific processes. There was nothing about having the weapon stuck inside of people's ribs. The game system doesn't go into those things. But then when we want to introduce firearms into a game that doesn't have those complexities in our minds, because we're familiar with them, we're automatically going to make the assumption that they need all these special rules and all this kind of stuff. So I would say that there's no reason why, as a limiting factor, as wanting to introduce them into the game, that they are automatically completely superior to everything else that exists. You probably need a lot of skill to use them, and even so, without rifling, because rifling didn't take place till many, many years later, they're not very accurate and they break down. And so, except for the fact that you can't see the ball being launched through the air, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to automatically have complete penetrating power through everything. You could always just say, well, if you want to add that advantage, you could just say, well, the damage is doubled, but they fire half as many times. So if you could fire an arrow once every round, maybe they only fire every other round or something. And of course, all the limitations you guys mentioned before about getting wet and the quality of the powder and all that kind of stuff. Vince says maybe if you use something like hirelings, they could use crossbows / firearms, but no bow until they're trained more and become archers. Prue says, after black powder guns and rifles came around, the way we fought and waged war changed completely. The bow is almost a melee weapon then. Yeah, because the range and accuracy of an archer probably diminished because of the use of like crossbows and stuff. Farther range, greater penetrating power, probably. Vince says in a time of early firearms, bows were vastly more accurate, had more range, and needed much less iron to create. And in this regard, we are, in terms of shaping a world, right? If firearms exist, we have to decide how are they given to the masses? Is there a king that has enough money and foresight to arm his people? Would they even want to arm the individuals? Are there people skilled and such? And so I would say the drama in terms of having firearms would be that interstitial stage, that stage where the player characters maybe are like on an espionage, where they have to free an individual who's working for like an evil king who's designing and creating these firearms that he can give to his army. Or maybe the player characters have to kidnap or assassinate that same individual because they're working for this other side. The idea of firearms means on a mass scale means that they are being produced by factories, that there is a standardization of sorts in terms of creating them. That may not exist in your fantasy world, or not yet exist in your fantasy world. In term, because I often wonder about this with gold coins. Like, are there factories punching out gold coins in the world, or are they made by individuals? And that means that the quality of them and the amount of them being created would have an extremely low rate until a government, a large, very large entity with a lot of money and resources comes into it and then wants to spread them amongst the people. Yeah, Prue says, but if we play in a world where guns are rare and inaccurate, and new, they'd of course exist side by side. Vince says also you have to take into account that in most fantasy settings, there are super skilled archers who can shoot stupid amounts of arrows or even magic arrows, while firearms would take ages to reload. So there would be someone super skilled with them right away. Prue says you don't need accuracy when the enemies are very close together. You just fire one shot into that mass, drop your useless gun, draw your sword, and run into them. Yeah, like the little pirates and stuff, right? And true about archers in fantasy settings, Vince. Good point. Vince says, or it wouldn't make sense at first because the skill of the user doesn't make such a big difference. And the other argument you often hear is that, and this goes side by side, right? Some people will say, if magic exists, there's no reason for firearms to exist, or if firearms exist, magic would go away because it's in the hands. And my contention is that both answers are correct and wrong at the same time, simply because we are working on either a completely fantasy basis, right? Like magic doesn't exist, so we have no basis to match it against, or they're working on literally one example of our own history, not including magic. And I think those two things together is where the drama would come in, right? So the people with let's take the idea of a super oppressive, one part of the world is oppressed by magic. There's probably and technology also exists. There's a chance that maybe those people being oppressed by magic, maybe a powerful lich or demon or dragon or whatever, or a cult of magic users is dominating the land. And you're going to have those people who don't have access to, normally I turn this down. You're going to have those people who don't have access to that magic, who are being oppressed, that are going to try to find the best weapon they can, which is going to be technology, because they don't need to worry about the training involved to fight against their oppressors. Vince says it wouldn't make sense at first because the skill of the user doesn't make a big difference. Zymok 111 says there's no cure light wounds gun. Yeah, but if you have a world with magic, they could cure a gunshot wound, whatever. Vince says that's BS in most fantasy settings. If magic exists, they would jump onto this new weapon and enchant the heck out of it. Well, see, and that's the other thing too, that we often seem to think that magic and technology don't mix. And the chances are that basically firearms would probably become the new wands, rods, and staves of the world. This is only if you create artificial reasons is it not possible for you to have magic versus technology theme, right? So because oftentimes we say like, what's one reasoning? If you can't see how it works, magic will foul up the gears of how that system particularly works or something. There's usually an artificial reason for why magic and technology do not blend together, whereas in many ways, like our own fantasy settings already, it just takes a reskin because we already have magic and technology blending together all in the game system. Vince was like, you can't enchant iron or something, like a reason like that, like, or I think I read a book series, but basically it was just something similar where if you can't see how the mechanism works, magic, your own mind will alter how the technology runs, and so it'll foul up the system or something. But when it comes to magic and technology, usually what happens is is it is very individualized, right? So one individual uses their magic to manipulate the technology as opposed to it being wide scale, especially if you have um, people who are in power who don't want that to spread. So you're going to have kings and leaders or barons or whoever, dictators, who not only want to limit magic, they're going to want to limit technology as well. And so shutting down, hunting down those people who are trying to produce firearms for the rebels, or um, use their firearms in their factories, and spread it to enemies or something, they're going to want to limit that as well. So it's not that it's not that once it exists, it's going to spread to the masses. And it may, but then how long will that take? 2 years, 50 years, 200 years, 2,000 years? It all depends. Playing in that region of uncertainty, I think, is where the drama is. It's not stopping gameplay to talk about what's going to happen in 200 years. It's like, well, why don't we just play in that 200-year period and see what happens? Frameshift says, if magic messes with tech, like in the Dresden Files, you'd still probably see some mundane people have them. And Vince says, is there a reason? Yeah. Vince says, because in something like Harry Potter, Muggle stuff doesn't work in Hogwarts, for example, but there's never a reason given for it. And Frameshift says, I forgot, but it affects all tech more advanced than something you'd see in World War II. And usually there is a like even in Shadowrun, you have essence, right? And I know I'm coming at it from a different angle, but in Shadowrun, technology takes away these almost spiritual, magical essence you have inside of you as you incorporate more technology into your body. And so that's their limitation of bringing your magic ability down when the technology steps up. But yeah, you can of course, as a creator, you can always make a reason why technology does or does not exist. But I think even on a practical level, your player character that wants to walk around with a bunch of firearms, they're going to have to not only where are they going to get all of the support staff required to keep firearms in working conditions as they move along. And of course, you also have to have your social implications too, right? In our own modern world, we had pirates and walking around with flintlock pistols, and they'd walk around with 4, 5, or 6 of them on their bodies because they could just pull one, fire it, drop the gun, pull another one, fire it, and everything to save them time from having to reload. But when you see somebody, coming off the deck of a ship with like 6 flintlock pistols strapped to their body, you're going to know that they want to cause trouble, unless of course they're in a port with a bunch of other pirates, which doesn't matter. But in a more peaceful, civilized nation, maybe that doesn't use firearms, when they see someone have them, they're automatically going to have a particular reaction to it, whether it's embracing them, whether it's arresting them, harassing them, anything like that. Also, there's nothing to say, if we're creating fantasy realms, there's nothing to say that black powder you can find anywhere, or that there is even black powder, right? This might be some kind of gemstone that needs to be ground up. It could be some kind of liquid chemical that needs to be enchanted. It could be, it's only mined from a particular mountain range somewhere to the south in your world. Maybe the processes of creating very good black powder versus low quality is only found in particular areas. So the materials may be found one location, the expertise may be found in another location, and trying to combine those things together might be the wars that happen in your world. That might be the dramatic tension. So the dwarves have the mountain ranges where they have their long bombardiers or cannonades or something like that, and they're very powerful but not very accurate, maybe just used to fight off against like giant-sized creatures or even giants to try to attack them. But then maybe you have on the other side of the world, someone has designed smaller firearms that don't exist where the dwarves are, because they use a finer method to create the black powder, but the dwarves own the stuff. Like it's in their minds. And so the drama could be in the middle with the people in the middle, like, oh, we don't want if we get these two things together, that's super harmful for the rest of us. Also, the problem with firearms is that if there's not problems, the danger of firearms is that if you're a magic person, you may not know who's walking around with these things. So you may want agents yourself. So if you're a lich, you don't want your people or even yourself getting shot in the back of the head. You are going to want agents out there to look for the people who sell firearms, the people who design them, attacking black powder caravans that are bringing the stuff down to be mined and or after the powder, the materials mined and turned into powder, to attack those locations where they're trying to create it. Vince says that the essence in Shadowrun is more of a balancing mechanism, right? In my opinion, and of course it's a balancing mechanism, because most games have a form, especially when you're mixing like magic or psionics with technology. You have to have some kind of balancing factor just for gameplay purposes. And usually the balancing factor is not players versus the world, it's players versus players. If you're playing like a Star Wars styled game, the player who has force abilities has to spend, some kind of way spend points on those abilities, having less other abilities, whether it's like combat abilities, piloting abilities, or something like that. Like you have to give up one to get the other. And so they try to, every game system designer will want to limit that, because otherwise then everyone's going to say, well, hey, we'll all be force users, or we're all going to have, 3 pistols plus magic or something, right? And in terms of like access to the public, I think is the big shift, whether you want to include or not include that into your world. So if player characters, even if they have access to firearms, do people know what they are, or does the public know? Like, are there people with long arms on castles? And even in feudal Japan, there were samurai that were seen with firearms when Europeans brought them over. And it's like, will they be accepted? Is that something that's accepted? Could it be limited because of religious reasons, cultural reasons, such as honor on the battlefield and in that conflict itself? Our own World War I saw that clash of high technology versus old world themes, where people would ride in the battle on horses and drawing their swords and charge right into long lines of people with firearms. Vince says, how would a world look where technology and magic advanced alongside each other up until modern or future times, or even enhanced each other? Would this just be engines who use magic crystals instead of gasoline, or something more interesting? And see, that's where I think the greater part is, right? I wrote in the notes, like technology versus magic and psionics, but who's to say they have to be against each other if one powers the other or is enhanced by the other? For example, I don't know, magic that is in you're able, or psionics that you can focus through computer systems, or like Vince said, like gasoline that's not really gas, but it's like magical crystals or something, or whatnot. Just blending the two together, I think would be awesome. As opposed to, like, I could imagine, just as off the top of my head, like imagine like a bounty hunter or something that's got a drone, like a modern day drone today, but that drone, this person maybe has magic and can cast magic through the drone, or the drone itself can cast like, mystical barriers or something against modern day fiends with the bat wings or something that's carrying a Gatling gun or something like that, right? It would just be I love the idea of mixing, having modern day mixed with fantasy, but has always existed side by side up until now, as opposed to like the big awakening. Zymock 111 says it would be interesting to think of how magic could cause all sorts of cause a sort of industrial revolution, especially if the magic helps form like you know, almost like the magic printing press or the magic factory making automobiles, or you know, enhancing either the speed at which it's made or the end result. For example, flying cars back in the like 1920s or something. You know, there could be hover cars back then, and just rewriting history. Like, yeah, it's magic that's making them float. The same magic that made carpets float, you know, in Persia or something. We're just taking that magic and, you know, Henry Ford's just putting into the brand new car or something. Vince says, I made something like this in Astrocetus, where I have a core that melds minds, where basically, which basically allows the crew to control the ship via psionics, but also create psionic constructs to emulate technology. Yeah. Matt Deadman says White Wolf's Meiji Ascension had tech magic as well. Meiji Ascension, love that game. Poo Poo says so kind of like an OP construct familiar. Yeah, I mean, if we, what's the movie? There's a Netflix movie called Bright, and I know the quality of the movie was panned. I know a lot of people were just like, oh, I had so many great ideas for it. Matt Deadman said they had a magic Terminator. Ooh, that's nasty. Oh man, like a magic Terminator, like a modern day doppelganger, but it's like a mechanical war forged underneath the skin. That'd be kind of cool. Vin says, why not mix the muses from Eclipse Phase with something like a familiar? Yeah, like an implant. It could be maybe a magic stone that instead of a computer, it's like a ghost or something that can, you know, talk to you in your head. So the ghost can be seen by others if it wants to, but otherwise it just, you can see the ghost floating through walls and stuff. Some you know, dead ancestor, and you can, you know, maybe you're armed with guns or something, but the implanted gem in the back of your head, or you know, the back of your forearm or something like that, allows you to communicate with it. Maybe it's an old family member. You know, like you're a modern day detective, but your ancestor was a powerful knight or something. So that, you know, that'd be kind of a cool way to mix the two, and maybe security systems in corporations incorporate magic and technology. So they've got thermal imaging and retina scans, plus they have arcane symbols on the walls, so you can't penetrate it with your psionics or your astral projection or something like that. Very much like Shadowrun, right? But in the movie Bright, on Netflix, at least available here in the States on Netflix, this was a world where like orcs and elves existed, where dragons exist, centaurs and those kind of things already existed side by side. And they had a prejudice against the orcs because the orcs had followed some great evil or something, and then that evil was defeated. And in that world, it was modern day, because like what was the magic wand was like considered like a nuclear weapon, right? It was a weapon of mass destruction, because you could wish for darn near anything, but most people could not wield a magic wand unless you were trained in magic or trained to harness its power or something. And then of course they had the elves, and it was pretty. I like the idea of the world building of that, especially with the you know, when the movie starts, they start the credits with also by telling you the story of the background of this world through the graffiti spray painted on the walls. And I think so. I think it was great world building. The execution may not have been that good. Frameshifts, what do you think of semi-magic railgun would do to a fantasy world? it has much easier to obtain parts like electronics aside than firearms. Um, uh, well, it would see. I'm. It depends on the scale, right? Meaning, like, is there just one railgun, or are there like, or is there a factory punching out railguns to align in armies? Because the effect of let's say a railgun might be the equivalent of like what some kind of high level magic like meteor swarm or something like that, and in which case the 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 act of it existing in the first place might create extreme dramatic tension. But as far as its effect on the world, that's going to be up to you and the players, and how it affects the world. It could be rumored that there's this giant, cannon that can reach over, 500 miles to reach another country, and it's basically a catapult that can fire things over the horizon or something. That could be a great danger where an evil continent is like basically bombarding the good people who are like hiding. Now they have to hide in caves or escape their world, or they don't know when the next shot's coming. And the players are on like a time limit of sorts to have to travel to this other country to stop that railgun. Now, if there's many of them, then we're talking like where who controls the railguns, assassination attempts against the people that are using them, sabotage against the railguns themselves, bribery of the people who are using magic that is powering them. You can come up with all kinds of story ideas behind that. As far as changing the world, if as the game master wants to advance the world, sure, you can advance the world and say, hey, railguns took over. Or you could say, well, there was an uprising and they destroyed them, but they're still hidden underground or something. You could come up with all those ideas. Vince says, maybe a special machine that can only be fired when you cast a specific spell on it to accelerate it, like induce a magnetic field spell, probably. There was a comic book series, I think it was called Red Star, where it was basically near future, and it was a great war across. They didn't ever explain. I guess it was assumed it was Earth, and they had tanks and like they had tanks in which they had cannons, and inside the cannons were people that were strapped in an X position. And when the cannons were fired, it was basically using their essence, their magic essence, to fire out these blasts. And they were essentially enslaved / sacrificial magi kind of thing. Or these engines were using their essence to fire them. It's kind of weird. It was nasty, and I loved it. But I can't remember the comic series. I believe it's called Red Star. But I'm grasping at straws with that one. Prue Prue says, there's some cool ideas for this in Mortal Engines too. Kind of a RoboCopy, scary things. It's not magic, but it is unknown tech that it seems like dark magic there. Yeah, Mortal Engines with whole cities, almost nations running around on like mobile cities with tracked bottoms kind of rolling around on the ground, I guess, after some kind of weird World War III event, and they just lifted cities and put them on mobile platforms and such. Kind of weird dark fantasy in a way with that. I agree with that. Looks like Mortal Engines is getting made into a movie, by the way. The trailer alone might be inspiring for the subject. Yeah, there's a trailer out there for it, and very weird. Like the cities are like I think London like ends up scooping up this other small city, probably because of the resources necessary. Maybe the mineral resources, the iron, the rusted out bits and pieces that they need to keep operating. Vince says they did stuff like that in Avatar: The Last Airbender, to where they had steam engines which were powered by fire bending. The idea of having you that's a classic one where a forge goes out, and in order to relight the forge you need magic or a dragon's breath or something of that nature. And you could have a factory, or even firearms or something, that do not operate unless they are energized by some sort of magic, like black powder that cannot be ignited unless a magic spark is given to it. In which case, the other limiting factor when it comes to magic and technology, where technology can spread to the masses, magic is very, very individual. It would be, I wouldn't say it would be impossible, but you could imagine that it would be very difficult to militarize magic, because once you train someone, um, those skills, if the skill is far more important than the device that they're using, usually skilled people become very valuable. And if someone recognizes their value, they're going to want to demand greater and greater compensation for those skills. And they will either become higher level in status in your community, or they will want to be, people will want to eliminate them because of their uh, greater knowledge about something. And so if you train up 50 mages and you want them to be on your front lines, there's a possibility that those mages might go, I don't want to fight on the front lines. I can blast you. If you disagree with me leaving the military, I'm just going to blast you. And then, by the way, my skills are too important. I'd rather teach someone else, or I want to discover other things. And so it's like you're arming someone who is not limited by you supplying them with equipment. And so, yes, I could see armies of mages versus armies of people with technology. And there will be people who are like culturally subservient to their culture, whether they have some kind of duty to their nation, they feel some kind of loyalty, they're fighting against a greater enemy across the border or something. But yeah, teaching people magic or giving them psionics or awakening them also has a limitation of, you're going to have I believe you're going to have a lot more outliers as opposed to people running around with firearms and such, where you could get rid of their equipment. They'll have harder access to resupply themselves, things like that. Vince says in Legend of Korra, their lightning bender could earn money by charging up machines in a factory. In which case, once you get an economy going, where there's like people who are, even people with like cantrips or something, that are like hired to power up things, whether it's lighting lights on light posts, or whether it's empowering factories or something, getting them started again. Getting that type of economy really sets up some dramatic elements, because you don't need to attack the technology. You just need to put a monkey wrench into the individual or individuals that are powering it, and by kidnapping them, bribing them, creating obstacles for them to get from one place to another, could be the limiting factor. So like, let's go back to the idea of the railguns. It could be that the railguns still exist and they're perfectly fine. They just don't fire because we need someone to power them. And maybe that nation is looking for individuals to power them. And in the beginning, they had volunteers. Now they're just like straight up like, we're just going to kidnap somebody and just, strap them to the gun and hope that it goes off or something. Zymox says, I would make an interesting safety for a weapons manufacturer to need a mage around to charge the weapons. Also, like when ship communications needed an engineer from the company to use them. And, in that case, what kind of demands is the factory making from the mage? Is the mage doing it like, yes, our nation needs these weapons to defend ourselves? Is the mage just being paid a lot and they're just mercenary? Is the king demanding their loyalty from this individual or individuals to do it? Are there rebel factions who are like, hey, can you energize some of these weapons and pass them just accidentally lose them off the wagons and give them to us. You have so many avenues to throw in before so-called technology and or magic dominates. There could be that friction that's happening when one exists side by side, and that's where I think the real game starts in. Vince says, hey, I can sell you these really powerful weapons, but you have to pay for them and constantly for the mage to make them usable too. Which, of course, I mean, exactly, right? It's like, maybe they know the secret of enchanting them permanently, but for right now, hey, I can enchant them. It's going to only last a week, but if you've got the cash, sure, I can stick around and ensure that your men are armed, which would be kind of ironic if there are people walking around with firearms that don't work and no one knows if they work or not because the mage that enchants them may or may not even be around, right? And you're just like, do I take the chance? I don't know. Oh man, oh, he pistol whipped that person. I still can't tell if the gun can fire or if they only have so many shots. And that mage is sitting back in his or her harem or brothel or something, all drunk. Yeah. Vince says similar how map makers was stupidly rich because you needed to have a navigator on big ships to read and interpret them, as well as having access to the most up-to-date maps. So it very well there could be this this proprietary ownership of mages or enchanters or whatever you want to call them that are like, yeah, you need me around, and by the way, you need to protect me too because hey, if I get shot, you have nothing. So pass me some more grapes because I'm tired. It's like yeah, they could very well be the movers and shakers of the world. And of course, if you want to translate this into like game mechanics or something, you could have a mage that's arming uh, soldiers with devices that cast cantrips or wands or something like that. It doesn't really matter. You can always reskin the hell out of just about anything in any game system. But having these individuals that are the proprietors of these things, and it doesn't necessarily mean this is in the fantasy realm, right? You could have these individuals in the future enchanting or energizing or powering technology with their minds or with magic in a modern setting or sci-fi setting where they're wearing helmets with gemstones on it that give them psionic abilities temporarily, or this person is enchanting weapons that fire like psychic power energy or something that hits them on a neurological level or something, or allows them to astral project or give them telekinetic abilities temporarily. Prue says, I love Hal for the role he plays in Hal's moving castle, going against arrogant warmongering royalty because he just knows more about the consequences if he joins. And again, that's our playground, right? That's where we want to play, where maybe this economy exists in this world where these mages are enchanting these devices and people are running around with so-called what they would consider technology, and the people who are rebelling against this know or can see maybe through oracles or reading the future, or they just know that if we go down this line, things are just going to get much, much worse, right? We're going to go from a fantasy realm of magic and such to this realm of industrial oppression and smokestacks and spitting out, I don't know, coal into the air, but it's tinged with some kind of like fiendish parasitic element to it or something like that. Like it's not just polluting the air, but it's like polluting your soul or what have you. In capturing their fleet or fire elementals that are powering these factories, and you can imagine like a a very dark, soot-covered, maybe not Victorian, what's steampunk-ish realm, and these individuals are fighting against it because they see what could happen when magic becoming industrialized just ruins society and ruins the world. Prue says he wants them to make do with their guns and lesser magicians, even if they lose, because if he and the other big ones join, humanity as a whole will suffer that much more. Yeah, Vincent also says also he kind of uses a combination of tech and magic. Really nice movie, underrated. Howl's Moving Castle. I haven't seen it. Hadn't heard of it really. I have to check it out. Frameshift says, I was going to mention spell rifles to apprentices that shoot cantrips so they can get used to the feel of using a spell. Technology that graduates you up to being able to do it on your own. That's a good idea as well. That on a lower level, that not really casters, maybe you could call them like apprentices slash privates or something, are being taught how to use these wands with handles or staves with straps on them or something like that, to get a use for casting what would essentially be a cantrip, but eventually they get used to harnessing that power on their own. Maybe it needs to be harnessed into a mechanical device, which is very dangerous to them if they harnessed it on their own, until they learn the skill kind of being able to harness it. In which case, the far more powerful wizards would, they don't need an external device. It's like grabbing one of the Infinity Stones, right? Like, and no mortal can hold on to Infinity Stone unless you've got the, you've become immortalized or something. Vince says, I always feel like wands would work kind of like that. How about VR training wizards? Much safer than throwing fireballs in real life. Ooh. Unless what you consider your VR is someone else's astral plane, they may not appreciate that too much. Poo says it's a Miyazaki movie. Says to me, if you're behind on those, I highly recommend them. A lot of steampunky, magicy stuff in there. I am very behind on Miyazaki movies. I have yet to hear one person put a negative comment about a Miyazaki movie. I just hear I am so behind on that. Damn. Yeah, you're so right. I've never any person that's ever seen any of Miyazaki's work, everyone's just like, you got to see it. You've got to see it. You got to see it. So yes, I am behind on them. I hear that they're very hard to come by. It's not like you just type Miyazaki into Netflix and they all show up. So I have heard that. I haven't looked it up. Maybe I'll just, when I get off here, I'll probably look it up on Netflix, YouTube, and Hulu, and what else do I have? Amazon Prime and that kind of thing. Matt Dedman says, except for the beige that can't separate reality from virtual reality. Ooh. Well, see, now we're getting into like virtual reality and other worlds, maybe, and maybe only in the mind of the beholder. Because you could train, you could have a whole system where people are being trained in virtual reality to kind of like speed up the training process, and also able to execute things in like casting fireballs in a virtual reality. You learn to do that and then brought back to Earth. But imagine also with virtual reality, you can manipulate their concepts, their fundamentals. So you could then use that to create people who are loyal, or at least like imagine an illusionary overlay. So like I believe this was in Black Mirror, where they had soldiers that had implants in their eyes and it looked like they were fighting zombies, or like zombie/vampires or something. But essentially what the overlay was doing is turning these basically innocent people into monsters so that they're easier to kill. So you could have these trained apprentices that just view every elf or every dwarf or everyone from this other nation as like something evil, ghouls and undead, and they feel like they're slaying the undead and they're hunters, but really they're just like killing innocent people because of the illusionary virtual reality or something. Vince says they are not perfect, but they have a high emotional impact because of the interesting characters and awesome visuals. Okay, I think like when it comes to like movie making, nothing can be perfect, but if you get something out of it, then it's already done its job, right? If you experience a piece of media and it changes the way you think of something, it sparks something in your head, you just walk away from it having a good time. That's not failure. Personally, I don't like Spirited Away too much. Saw it as a kid, kind of got traumatized by the parents get turned into pig scene. Ooh. I love most of them because of the characters and the non-westernized storytelling. Yeah, and that's the great thing about finding media elsewhere, different storytelling, different comedic beats, dramatic beats, how far they're willing to go into dark areas, those kind of things, which you when you're born and raised on a more of a westernized stateside media, it's great to have a palate cleanser. Sometimes it's really great to have one because after a while things become kind of sanitized, ritualized. Yeah. So anyway, we're reaching the hour mark. I just wanted to throw out some things there. It caused a little controversy just because of the title, like technology versus magic. You guys know me. It's just, for me, it's creating drama. It's not about the argument. It's not about the above table argument, stopping play to argue about, well, if guns are in D&D, they're just going to ruin everything because they're just going to go through stuff. And it's like, well, sure, but why don't we play that out, right? Like, if your contention is that firearms are going to ruin the fantasy realm, because in real life they did, then why don't we play that out? Why don't we play out the 500 years it took firearms to really refine themselves? Why don't we play out the intricacies, the wars, the courtships, the espionage, all that kind of stuff. Play that part out. Play out how magic, gets subsided. Play out the death throes of dragons as they're eliminated by, railgun howitzers or something. Play out the hover tank panzers that are, floating on tensors, floating discs with magi inside, and firing, I don't know, spirit bombs of ghosts at people or something. Like, play that part out, play that drama out. That's my thing. Like, don't waste that energy arguing about it. Like, let me make a character. I want to play in that world. Vince says, I think that's a big reason anime so interesting to someone here, or why something like Black Panther was so successful. It shows you something fantastic from another point of view. And Vince says, great conflict to make a game of Microscope. Right. So, and just like you were saying with the story, the different storytelling point of view, just being able to, I think sometimes we have become so ingrained in how we think things should be that we just say, well, that's how things are, as opposed to trying to find it out from someone else's point of view, from the little guy's point of view, or even breaking down, like, okay, let's go from development of, for example, development of firearms to AK-47s being handed out like candy. There's something in the middle there. And Microscope is a great game. I don't know if you want to call it a game, world building game of sorts, that you can develop a world with a group of people and go, hey, all right, here's the idea. We have this, we want to make a world with magic. We want magic and technology to run side by side, or technology and psionics, or whatever, all three to run side by side. Let's do Microscope, and each of us add our little bits into it, throw in a ton of little monkey wrenches, how things change, how things develop. Rebels that found a factory and stole some weapons, and then now they get them. A great earthquake took out a king's keep that had, you know, the secret to this certain technology. All those little kind of things that might change how the world develops, and then find out, okay, here's the beginning, here's the end, how do we get there? um African sci-fi is super interesting, especially when you have cultures today that are underserved, or through the course of development in the world that were not fully explored, like the Arctic Inuits, or you know, the United States indigenous people, or African tribes, or I don't know, Mongolian hordes or something like that. Like just layering on top of them. Like, imagine if they existed, their ancient culture existed side by side with this growing technology, and then having that storytelling take place. One of the greatest books ever, that I find ever written, that I read, was Shogun, and it was about, you know, European sailors that come to a fictional, not, I guess it was fictionalized Japan, and that clash of cultures, and how this privateer sailor gets indoctrinated into this culture, and it's just really great. Reading Hero in a Thousand Faces is worth it for tons of tales from around the world alone. All kinds of different myths and legends used as examples for this theory. Yeah, Proust is very much so, Vince. Some good authors getting recognized at the moment. Yeah, always great to have a ton of inspirational things, especially when it comes from a direction that you're not used to. Now, I will say that sometimes it can be a little jarring, based on how someone writes from a different culture, their filmmaking process, whether it's music or something. It can be a little jarring, but I think just pushing through it. Yeah, Matt Dedman said Shogun's also a movie. It was a television series of sorts, like 8 hours or something, 10 hours or what have you, back in the 70s, maybe early 80s for Shogun. The book is awesome. It's like there's no good guys in that book. It's very Game of Thrones. If you're a Legend of the Five Rings person, you're gonna love Shogun. Frameshift says, had fun, got some great ideas. Can use for my world building. Thank you. No, thank you. Yeah, guys. So I'm gonna cut it here. Thanks for joining me, Frameshift and Matt Dedman. As always, here 6 a.m. Monday through Friday. Always. Thanks for joining me. It's basically, I don't know why I call it World Building Wednesdays, because hell, we world build 5 days a week plus every other Sunday, so whatever. But I'm here 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Of course, go straight to YouTube, so if you miss it, no big deal. You can just play it at work or when you're driving around or something like that. Always love to have people join in. I'm a collective, so I'm not one who's like, oh, I hate this, I love that, screw that. It's more like, man, take all that energy and bring it together. Role-playing games are an excellent way to look at other people's way of life and the way they think, and go, hey, if we got a question, throw it in a game. You got some conflict, let's throw it in a game. Let's see what happens. Just for world building in general. So guys, thank you very much, and I will see you later.